Chapter 741, Spending the Night Part 1. As Xietain filled the plate he had brought to the kitchen as it was being finished by everyone unnoticed in the midst of the entertaining conversation, he looked over his shoulder as he sensed a series of light footsteps. "Oh, Mengqi. What's happening?" he asked with a faint smile before turning his face to continue with the task at hand. "Not much." Mengqi walked over and without asking him if he needed help began to help cut the snacks. "Lily seems to be a good girl at first glance." "She's a good girl, a very good person. I'm sure you will like her very much the more you get to know her and you will be good friends in the future," Xietain said with a smile. Mengqi simply nodded without saying much about it. However, after a few brief seconds of silence, she said somewhat worriedly, "But, big brother, I feel like she is hiding something." The movements of Xietain stopped and a flash of surprise shone in his eyes. He didn't think Mengqi was being paranoid or anything similar. Instead, Xietain thought his younger sister had very sharp eyes or a terrifying sixth sense for things. Xietain smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, "Mengqi, actually, the real name, or rather, the full name of her is Lilith, not Lily." "Eh? Lilith?" Mengqi's eyes widened and she subconsciously asked, "Is Lily a simple abbreviation that you all use for Lilith?" "Something like that." Xietain nodded at the same time as he sighed. He really didn't want to lie to Mengqi, therefore, after thinking about it for a moment, he said in a low voice, "Mengqi, Lilith's true identity is too shocking, let's say. Wait for a while and you will naturally learn about her." "The identity of the girl her brother brought home is shocking?" Mengqi blinked dumbfounded. If Lilith's identity was something great in the past then Mengqi might not care too much. After all, the great identities of the past meant nothing in the current world or at least no longer carried the same weight they used to. Xietain was proof of that. Even though he possessed a great government title, the man obediently handed over everything when Xietain arrived even though he was nothing more than an ordinary young student in the past. However, Xietain was saying that Lilith's identity is shocking, not that it was shocking. Was Lilith a shockingly powerful person? Was she something like a beast princess that had acquired human form after evolving to a very high stage and for that reason she had such a perfect body like that? Thousands of theories, each one wilder than the last, began to flash in Mengqi's head as she tried to figure out who this woman was. Xietain naturally had no idea of Mengqi's thoughts or he might have laughed a little. However, he didn't explain much more either, so after a few words the two remained in tactful silence as they finished what they were doing. When the two returned to the living room from the kitchen, Xietain reprimanded them in a kind voice saying that they could have let her do the homework. After more than 2 hours, they had all eaten so much that if it weren't for the fact that they were high-level soul evolvers with big appetites, they wouldn't have had any room left for dinner. Xietain had gone to great lengths to cook all kinds of dishes, from white meats such as mutant chicken and first-order red scale fish to red meats such as mutant pork or fresh mutant vegetables. Mengqi and Lilith exchanged several glances throughout the dinner and seemed to be communicating only with their eyes. The not-so-subtle action of the two young girls not only confused Xietain and Baidilan but also left Xietain a bit speechless. When it was close to midnight, Lilith stood up and was preparing to take her leave when Xietain stepped forward and stopped her. "Lily, why don't you stay for the night?" Actually, Xietain wanted to propose to her new daughter-in-law to stay and live with them directly, but she felt that it was too soon and might end up scaring the girl, so she made a somewhat smaller request for now. "This." Lilith looked at Xietain as if she was asking for permission, and this caused Xietain to give him a stern glare as if she was warning him to be careful with his next words unless he wished to meet her new pair of flip-flops that she had recently acquired. While Xietain cursed Lilith several times in his heart, the culprit laughed and rubbed her hands together mentally like a little imp who was succeeding in her wicked deeds. Lilith would stay in the house even if Xietain didn't ask for it, so her somewhat hesitant and fearful attitude was clearly faked to cause some difficulties for Xietain. However, it seemed to be that Lilith still didn't know the new facet of Xietain very well after his stone heart skill evolved. "Oh, that's a good idea, Mom." Xietain walked over to Lilith and hugged her around the waist, marveling at the softness of her body even through the clothes she was wearing and for a moment wanting to rip all the fabric into a million pieces before restraining himself. He looked at the stupefied Lilith and said with a smile, "We're both used to sleeping under the same roof anyway, aren't we?" Few.cm. There were different reactions to Xietan's little gesture and his words. "Kia! Big brother Bai, so bold. So disgusting, he 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 he." Try to guess who it was. Luoning and the Wen twins started making a fuss right away. These three little elves seemed to have infinite stamina in their systems as they never got tired even though they kept laughing and jumping all over the place. Baidilan looked at his son's hand on the young woman's waist, and for a split second he couldn't help but feel a strange force of envy invade him, but he quickly shook his head and the feeling disappeared so quickly that even Baidilan himself began to doubt if it had really been there. The expression on Meng Qi's face did not change at all, and the faint smile on her face did not waver even for an instant, so it was hard to tell what her thoughts or feelings were. In fact, she even chuckled as she watched the scene. On the other hand, the eyes of Yilinger sparkled brightly as her intense glance went back and forth between her son and daughter-in-law. She was very pleased with Lily, and even though she was just getting to know the girl, Yilinger was determined to make her the first wife of the royal harem she had planned for her son in the future. As Yilinger watched how close the two of them seemed to be and the lovely blush on Lily's face, she couldn't help but think that she might soon be enjoying her first grandchild, and a big smile grew on her face at the mere thought of it. It seemed that her little boy had finally become a man after all. Time really flew by. Yilinger still remembered when she was changing his baby diapers, but soon he might be changing diapers. If Baizemin and Lilith knew about Yilinger's thoughts, the two of them probably wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the end, after some quick arrangements, and even though the house was considerably large enough for almost everyone to have their own room, things were fixed by Yilinger so that everything went the way she wanted things to go. In one of the rooms, Meng Qi would be sharing her bed with little Luo Ning. In another room of the house, Wen Yun and Wen Yan would be sharing a bed. The twins still did not feel comfortable sharing a room with another person, even if it was someone of the same age as them, so they could only be together. The master bedroom was naturally occupied by Yilinger and Baidilan. As for Baizemin and Lilith, "You little scoundrel, you're happy about this, aren't you?" Lilith asked with an adorable pout on her face. Stop acting as if it's the first time we slept together." Baizemin rolled his eyes as he teased her. "Bah, cheeky." Lilith gently patted his chest, and just like Baizemin rolled her eyes. They were both lying on a double bed, the lights were off, so the only source of illumination they both enjoyed was from the moonlight and starlight penetrating the glass of the closed window and the semi-transparent curtains on the second floor. Next to the bed were several pillows placed on the floor and even quilts and sheets, forming a temporary bed. There, inside, a metallic gray egg glowed dimly in silence while something in it seemed to be beating like a heart. The bodies of Baizemin and Lilith were delicately covered by silk sheets and a thick feather quilt that reached up to the chest area, exposing the wide shoulders of the male and the delicate shoulders of the female. Baizemin couldn't help but gently caress Lilith's shoulder at the sight of the moon's radiance raining down on her skin, and an involuntary sigh escaped his mouth as he honestly praised, "Your skin feels as soft as if you just rubbed large amounts of cream on it. I don't think I'd tire of it even in a million years." "A million years? You offend me." Lilith chuckled softly, and her body under the sheets jiggled tantalizingly even though she didn't do it willingly. "You know what I'm talking about. Let's go to sleep for now, okay?" Baizemin withdrew his hand and casually placed it on his crotch as if he had finally found the right position to step into dreamland. However, Lilith was not someone easy to fool. She knew exactly what was going on, as she had known many men react to her body and get embarrassed even though she had never been as close to any as she currently was to the little man she was lying with at the moment. Instead of hiding this, why don't we put it to good use? Baizemin didn't even have time to say anything, let alone react, when the hand of Lilith shot out from within the sheets, and with agility that he couldn't follow let alone comprehend, she caught the hand resting on his crotch quite naturally. Before he could tell her to stop, Lilith had already lifted his hand from there, and what he had tried to hide in shame naturally revealed itself to the world. The heavy, thick quilt stuffed with goose feathers was easily lifted by a strange object that was draped underneath but pointed steadily skyward. That object occasionally seemed to shudder or pulsate, causing the quilt to move in sync before returning to its position. "Lilith, you little witch." Baizemin blushed slightly when his boner was discovered, but he didn't try to hide and instead blamed it on the woman next to him. Lilith looked at the object hidden under the sheets, and without thinking or realizing it, her little pink tongue came out of her mouth, licking slowly and tantalizingly on her lips. "What can I do? I'm too hot after all," she said, getting on her knees. The movement naturally caused the sheets covering her body to slide down, revealing that underneath she was wearing a seductive jet black baby doll. The bewitching bed dress was made of a special fabric that tantalizingly revealed the milk-white skin barely hidden underneath, leaving the bust area especially exposed and the now hard nipples barely covered from the eyes by the perfectly shaped rose embroidery embroidered to heighten the men's imaginations. "Lilith? What are you doing?" Baizemin's voice sounded husky and his eyes grew hot practically instantly, roaming over the figure of the kneeling woman just inches from his grasp. Even though Baizemin had seen her put on that baby doll before they both went to bed, and he even reprimanded her for teasing him, The stiffness still covered by the quilt grew even more as the blood in his body began to pump faster and with more vigor. Lilith watched the growth of his male root intently, and the heat in her eyes also began to rise. At the same time, her beautiful boobs began to rise and fall heavily in sync with her increasingly erratic breathing. She couldn't help but rub her thighs together as she said in a whispery voice, "Maybe I should take responsibility for it." Chapter 742 Spending the Night Part 2 Take responsibility for it? Xietain couldn't believe those words came out of Lilith's mouth. Not because he thought she was being a cheap woman or because she was out of character, of course. The reason he couldn't believe she was saying and bringing up the idea of taking responsibility for his boner was completely different but at the same time normal. Lilith. Xietain bit his tongue from how nervous he was, which was why he had to pause. Unfortunately, there was no way he could calm down in this kind of situation. What kind of man could act calm in front of a woman like Lilith was? Not even those who had appreciation for those of the same sex would be able to stand their ground. Xietain was sure of it, even less so when it was a virgin man as was his case. Least of all when what he was about to say might lead to his greatest wish in this moment to not be fulfilled. His black eyes practically spat burning flames as they roved over the ravishingly soft white silhouette dimly illuminated by the moonlight. She was so close that Xietain only needed to reach out a hand to feel her velvet thighs, and if he dared, he could even go beyond the short baby doll that stopped just inches from revealing all of her. "Are you worried about my charm affecting your mind?" Lilith asked in a low voice. Actually, even she was surprised at how excited she had become after seeing that Xietain was getting such a potent hard-on. Could it be the fact that the person reacting to her beautiful and sexy body was the man she loved? Lilith didn't know, she just knew she needed to do something with herself or else she might jump on him and eat him right there. Xietain hurriedly shook his head and out of fear of being misunderstood immediately explained, No, it's not like that. I do know charm is an untrackable passive stat just like critical hit percentage is, it's not something we can really control. It's already impressive that you can suppress yourself all this time. But, if you and I have relations with our current power difference. I know what you mean. Lilith nodded as if she understood, but her ruby eyes still fixed on Xietan's manhood were somehow like the eyes of a beast staring at its prey and anxiously waiting for the right moment to swallow it whole. Lilith extended her left arm next to her right hand and her index finger slowly came out of her clenched fist. Her movements were very careful as for the first time her ruby-colored eyes moved to look at the face of the man lying next to her. However, Xietain was too busy following the movement of her arm so he couldn't care less whether she was looking at him or not. His black eyes slowly widened as he focused on her fingertip and a glint of incredulity flashed in his pupils as she used the tip to touch the tip of his stiffness. Xietain gritted his teeth and a small growl was trapped inside his throat, echoing raspily within the room. It wasn't that he couldn't stand a simple touch, the reason behind his reaction was different. It was because even though it was just a little push through the sheets and not even a direct touch, the person who was doing it was the woman he loved and had been lusting after for a long time. It was like when you wish with all your heart to taste a delicious dessert but you can only taste it after several years, you would surely close your eyes and sigh with great pleasure. Xietain had resisted the temptation of many women, and even though he could have enjoyed many beautiful women in this span of time, he never did it, even in the midst of all the tension he lived in. He did not give in. This only served to add fuel to the flames. "Don't worry, as long as it's only small actions. We should be fine." Xietain turned to look at Lilith. She was still looking at him, her little mouth opening and closing tantalizingly with each breath causing her prominent breasts to jump up and down like two bunnies, trying to get attention and in search of some affection. And indeed, they would soon receive the affection they so desperately craved. She said it was okay, didn't she? Like a tiger finally released from its bonds, Xietain sat on the bed and without warning grabbed Lilith by the shoulders. She didn't struggle at all when he pushed her down and in just an instant the two of them were looking into each other's eyes with engulfing warmth. Then, "It's okay as long as we don't go too far over the line, right?" Xietan's hoarse voice was proof of how dry his throat was, and Lilith knew he was thirsty but not precisely thirsty for water but for her. "Surprise me, champion." Lilith narrowed her eyes and a playful glint shone in her pupils. She blew gently on his face and whispered in a particularly appealing voice, "I'll return the favor depending on how much of a man you prove to be." A slightly wild smile grew at the corner of Xietan's lips. "Ryup, let me show you how much of a man I am." Xietan's voice echoed through the four walls along with the sound of cloth being torn and the gasp of a woman followed immediately behind. "Brat, that was one of my favorites. Be obedient and be still." Xietain whispered in her ear, making Lilith's bones feel weak at his soft but strangely commanding voice. Xietain looked intently into her eyes as he used a piece of cloth from the torn baby doll to tie Lilith's hands. He brought her hands up, just above her head, and using the long end of the spare piece of cloth, tied a knot in the back of the bed. "You little minx. You've teased me long enough, don't you think?" Xietain straightened his posture and stayed on his knees. His eyes flashed with passion, but somehow he managed to hold back the desire to pounce and devour the woman on the bed. "If I don't make you call me daddy tonight, then I'd rather stop being a man." Lilith was lying on her back, her arms had been raised and her hands brought to the top of her head with her wrists bound with a piece of cloth that could easily rip and tear free, but she did nothing of the sort. Her black hair was a tantalizing mess and her ruby eyes burned with desire as she stared into the black eyes of the man towering over her like a dominant beast. "First you wanted me to call you big brother, but now you want me to call you daddy? Your pervert level is rising, little brother Xietain," she said mockingly and clearly trying to mess with him. "Hee hee." Xietain chuckled softly and a dangerous glint flashed in his eyes as he whispered in a raspy voice, "Let's see if you can continue playing like this later. You dare to make a bet with me? Who fears whom?" Lilith raised her chin boldly and challenged him. "Well, the game is simple." Xietain watched her face and his eyes slowly lowered gradually. Phoenix eyes, small nose, little mouth teamed with a beautiful pair of kissable lips, slender and graceful neck. When Xietan's eyes reached the chest area, he stopped there for a moment. The baby doll had been torn by him so the center was open, revealing the interior of the deep valley but leaving the mountains covered for his imagination to play with. As his increasingly hot eyes continued to drift down to her flat, fat-free abdomen, he said in a choppy voice, "If within the next 60 minutes I can't get you to climax, then it will be your turn to play with me. However, during those 60 minutes you are not allowed to use any force or free yourself from your bonds. If you win, then for one day I will do anything, whatever you ask of me no matter what it is. If you lose, then you will do whatever I say for 24 hours. If we both fail, then we will repeat it again for another 60 minutes each. How about it, do you dare?" Just before he finished his words, Xietain gently reached his hands forward and with only 2 fingers of each hand grasped the tip of the 2 ends of the torn baby doll. His eyes locked onto hers as he slowly began to move the torn fabric sideways, revealing more and more of her beautiful creamy skin with the moonlight and starlight as the only witnesses to the wonderful sight his eyes appreciated. Lilith felt the soft touch of the fabric caressing her skin and for a split second a flash of worry was born in her heart before it quickly died. When she noticed the beastly fire burning in her partner's eyes, Lilith couldn't help but smile internally and immediately knew victory would be hers. "Done, let's play." She smiled disdainfully and whispered in a slightly arrogant voice, "However, I also have my own rules." Xietan's eyes glinted strangely but Lilith didn't notice. He nodded without replying verbally as he seemed too enchanted with the wonderful body in front of him waiting to be devoured. The confidence Lilith felt grew as she saw him drooling over her and said, "New security, we can't touch our lower private parts with anything but hands and fingers. The current you just can withstand so much thanks to several of your skills, but you will definitely have to wait until the 2nd order before we can go a step further and until the 3rd order before we can take the final step in our relationship." "That's all?" said Xietain in a low and almost inaudible voice even as the house was in total silence and the outside world seemed to have fallen under a mysterious mute spell. Lilith puckered her lips and whispered tantalizingly, "Come to me." She expected that when her words fell Xietain would immediately attack her. This was especially true because he had just finished opening her torn baby doll completely and her body was fully revealed before his eyes. However, to Lilith's surprise, nothing could be further from the truth. Under the faint moonlight and starlight that penetrated from the window, Lilith's white skin glistened and showed itself unhindered for Xietain to feast his eyes on. Her body could only be described as perfect as there were no words worthy to truly describe it, and even though Xietain thought he knew what he was about to encounter, he couldn't help but be stunned for a brief moment. He took his time to appreciate her. His eyes stopped first on her long legs that shined like 2 ivories and whose softness he could feel even though he had not yet touched them. His hot gaze slowly ascended to her fleshy thighs that begged to be worshipped before slowly moving to the junction of both legs. Even though Lilith had both legs closed, Xietain did not open them. He would take his time with this, he was definitely going to win this game. His eyes moved to her small navel, and continued their ascent making Lilith feel as if several small ants were stinging her even though he had not touched her yet. That trepidation she had felt before grew in her heart again except that this time it didn't disappear easily as it did before. "What's wrong? You think you can give me pleasure just by looking at me with lust? Your time is still running out. Don't you think it would be nice to look at me later?" Lilith kept her composure and said mockingly, "How about you better give up? This big sister will let you see her body later if she's in a good humor. However, Xietain did not immediately retort to her words. When his burning eyes landed on the area he had most wanted to see of her all this time, the lust that flooded every cell of his body and that Xietain believed could not continue to grow shot skyward in the blink of an eye. Lilith's breasts were just wonderful. She was very well equipped in the breast area. Each of those two giant marshmallows seemed to have their own anti-gravity skill, as even though Lilith was upside down her pink nipples pointed towards the ceiling of the room without sagging at all. Those two pink tips were the tops of both snow-capped mountains, white mountains and completely free of any stain or impurity. As Xietain stared at her mirror-like bosoms reflecting the silver-white light of the night world coming through the window, he had no problem admitting that Lilith's boobs were by far the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his entire life. Not even the gods would be able to recreate such beauty, and not even the most famous painters in history could portray such perfect charm if they had the chance to see them. Of course, a possessive man like Xietain would never let another man see the body of the woman in his bed. Less so now that he knew how beautiful this work of art was. Xietain felt a horrendous amount of pain in his crotch, but he didn't need to look down to know what was happening. His level of arousal had reached such a high point that his manhood had grown to a peak he didn't know it could reach. Suddenly, the blood inside his body began to rush out of control and Xietain moved to pounce on her like a rabid lion. However, he bit his tongue so hard that he almost tore off a piece and small drops of blood greeted his taste buds, waking him up. He quickly used blood manipulation, and though barely, he began to regain the composure he had almost completely lost. His eyes moved higher, meeting Lilith's surprised eyes. Hee. What's the matter, are you afraid? I just let out some of the charm I'm keeping locked in, what's wrong with that? Lilith snorted and didn't try to hide what she did. Xietain had already noticed it, so there was no point in hiding it. Xietain smiled devilishly and his eyes glinted as he said in a hoarse voice, "My little Lilith. You seem to have forgotten that my two fortes lie under the names willpower and perseverance." Humph. Words will get you nowhere. Even though she said those words, Lilith couldn't help but doubt in her heart. Xietain was still something of a mystery to her, even though ironically she knew him so well. Lilith had no idea what kind of man he was in bed, but she was slowly becoming aware of his preferences and innermost lust. Had she really made a mistake? Tonight I will definitely make you call me daddy and beg me obediently no matter what. Chapter 743 Victory and Defeat, Part 1. The first thing Xietain did was something very few men would do. Instead of immediately rushing to the chest area, instead of touching those two beautiful soft, firm, and fluffy-looking treasures, he leaned forward while resting the weight of his body on his two hands and buried his face in Lilith's neck. Lilith felt his breath caress her skin tenderly, but the next thing Xietain did sent a shiver throughout her body. After delighting to intoxication with the exquisite rose scent of Lilith's body, Xietain closed that small distance of an inch or two and very carefully and delicately planted a small kiss on the left side of her swan neck. The body of Lilith twitched slightly, probably due to surprise. But Xietain knew that a simple kiss would have no effect. But he was really looking forward to see what would happen after several minutes. 1, 2, 3. Xietain planted delicate small and long kisses on the neck of Lilith. They were not quick kisses, but he took his time and let 2 or 3 seconds pass between each of his kisses, moving from the top left to the middle and then moving down to the clavicle area before moving to the right side and applying the same treatment. After 5 minutes, Xietain added one more small but not insignificant step. His hands, which had been supporting the weight of his body, moved downward and in an instant disappeared from Lilith's line of sight. She realized that he was supporting his body with his leg and hip muscles, but she didn't have time to think too much as she soon realized what he wanted to do with his hands. The movements of Xietain stopped for a split second when he heard a small sound similar to the weak meowing of a little kitten. The sound was so low that it could easily have been missed by even the strongest soul evolvers, but given that the night was particularly silent and he was planting little kisses on the kitten's neck, that sound did not go unnoticed from him. Lilith thought she had not been heard, so she secretly gritted her teeth and said nothing. In reality, her mind was slowly starting to get a little fuzzy, so there were little details that were slowly being overlooked. She had already been quite aroused even before all this started. However, the little kisses from Xietain were like adding fuel to the fire. But when he started to caress her legs using nothing but his fingertips as if he was afraid of touching them too hard and hurting her, Lilith felt a shiver running through the area between her legs, so she couldn't help but let out a small sound. At the same time as Xietain started to gently and very delicately caress the top and outer sides of Lilith's thighs using only his fingertips as if they were feathers, he moved his body further down as he planted little kisses on every inch of her skin. The sound of the sheets accompanied his movements along with the sound his lips made each time they met her skin. A minute later, Xietain reached the top of her breasts and paused for a moment to appreciate such a wonderful work of art. Lilith thought that Xietain was finally going to pay attention to one of her sensitive areas and subconsciously lifted her upper body slightly to present her left breast to him. Xietan's eyes burned with fierce fire looking at that pink tip tempting him and could easily be reached if he stuck out his tongue. However, he didn't linger. He bit his tongue again before moving his body and started planting more delicate kisses all over her left arm. Lilith let out a small growl of frustration as she was surprised at how good but at the same time how frustrating it felt to be kissed on the arm. She knew very well that arms were not erogenous zones, but Xietan's little feather-like kisses were so soft and delicate that it felt like several hundred ants were walking on the parts he kissed. After 2 minutes, he moved again and began kissing her other arm for the same amount of time as the left one. During all this time, his hands moved as gently as his little kisses, roaming her outer and upper thighs with extreme care. What are you doing? Lilith growled in frustration as she felt Xietan's little kisses circling the outline of her breasts but not touching them. He had been planting feather-like kisses on the circumference of her boobs, and his hands that had been teasing her thighs now moved to her midsection, caressing it so softly and delicately that it bordered on torture. Xietain stopped as he heard her voice, frustrated and tinged with annoyance. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath before saying in a lust-filled voice with a dry throat, "Can you smell it?" "Smell it?" Lilith was surprised. However, when she sharpened her sense of smell, her face blushed and a flash of embarrassment shone in her eyes. SSF.XSS. Even though this is the first time I smell it, my male instincts know that this is the scent of a woman in heat. Xietan's husky voice was low and enticing, like the devil's voice in Lilith's ears, seducing her step by step. Your female pheromones float through the air, tempting my male pheromones to take care of you. Lilith's eyes flashed with a hint of embarrassment again, and she was about to say something when she stopped and hermetically closed her lips and eyes after seeing Xietain submerging his face towards her breasts. It was finally happening. Lilith was inwardly happy that the torture was over. But she was being naive. Too naive. In the middle of the room, dimly lit by the glow of the moon and starlight, the sound of silk sheets ruffling in tune with a woman's body moving uncomfortably, as well as the sound of soft, delicate kisses, were the only two sounds heard for a long 5 minutes. After 5 minutes of having Xietain gently kissing her right breast while the fingers of his right hand tortuously slowly caressed her left breast, Lilith finally could not bear it as a frustrated growl accompanied by a moan of pleasure created a strange sound that echoed loudly in the room. Xietain raised his head slowly and his eyes black as night met two ruby-colored eyes looking at him with naked lust and a hint of anger caused by frustration. "Xietain, why are you doing this? Are you going to give me pleasure or are you going to torture me for the whole hour?" Lilith's voice echoed off the walls, and considering that even the weakest soul evolver in the house was around level 20, the odds that her frustrated words dragged out in a long moan of discomfort had been heard were not necessarily low. However, the male and female were too lost in lust and desire to notice such things. "Sure, you will suffer a little at first, but believe me, when the time comes to release all that frustration, you will feel much more pleasure than usual. And how do you know these things when you are just a virgin boy? I have the author's knowledge, don't forget that. Again with your novels and ang." The words Lilith was saying were interrupted by a sudden groan. She arched her back up and her head back as she felt Xietan's hands now beginning to tease her inner thighs. Even though she knew he would continue to torture her with tantalizingly slow movements that felt good but also tried her sanity, Lilith couldn't help but feel hope in her heart, hope that the cruel man towering over her body would finally show her some mercy. The feeling of constantly going up and down was similar to a roller coaster for Lilith, a roller coaster of pleasure and discomfort. After playing with Lilith's boobs and teasing her for about 7 or 8 minutes, Xietain suddenly stopped and moved down. Lilith was so confused at this point that she didn't even notice the shadow towering over her disappear, and it wasn't until she felt one of her legs leave the bed that she finally woke up from her dreamy state. What are you doing?" Lilith asked softly and with gasps in between. Xietain carefully lifted her left leg and let the back rest on his right shoulder while using his left hand to gently caress the inside of her right thigh. As his black eyes met Lilith's blurry, dreamy eyes, Xietain brought his lips to her beautiful feet and began to kiss it sweetly. "Ah!" A cry of anxiety mixed with a tinge of pleasure filled the room as Xietan's lips touched the side of Lilith's left foot. Wait, that's ah. Xietain turned a deaf ear to Lilith's words and she could only continue moaning for the first 2 minutes as soon the room was occupied by 3 sounds: the sound of kissing, the sound of the silk sheets rustling under the erratic movements of the female writhing in pleasure and discomfort, and the sweet moans and grunts of her. The foot was one of the erogenous zones of the body usually forgotten, not for nothing many people were willing to pay for massages in that area. What Lilith felt at first was a mixture of pleasure with tickling due to the gentle and torturous treatment from Xietain. However, once her body adapted to his kisses, all she began to feel was pleasure and the tickling disappeared without a trace. Xietain kissed Lilith's left foot for 5 minutes while using his opposite hand to caress the inside of her right thigh for the same amount of time. He did the same with her right foot and the same with her left thigh for 5 minutes more. During those 10 minutes, Lilith was slowly turning into the mess that Xietain wanted to see. Her hair was disheveled due to how many times she shook her head, her posture was sloppy with her legs spread wide open, her blurry eyes seemed to be starting to fill with tears of pleasure and powerlessness. A glimmer of drool could be seen at the corner of her half-open little mouth through of which sexy low growls were continuously slipping out. However, there was another point at which Xietain was watching. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight and starlight coming in from the window. There was a special smell inside the tightly closed room where the ventilation did not run freely. This smell was so sweet and fragrant that Xietain could not help but take several deep breaths as his black eyes flashed fiercely looking at the source. Due to the strange feeling of pleasure and lust she felt, Lilith couldn't care less about her sloppy posture. With one of her legs raised and the other obediently spread outward so that Xietain could have better access to her inner thigh, he could see the dark stain on the white sheet resulting from the dampness escaping from her femininity. The eyes of Xietain were like 2 torch lanterns, bright flashlights in the midst of the darkness. While he made sure to pleasure and torture his partner a little, he had to make use of every fiber of his willpower and perseverance as if he was fighting a powerful enemy and great amounts of pain were assaulting him. This was because if he didn't restrain himself, he would definitely pounce on her. Those 2 beautiful soft and delicious-looking full lips seemed to be tempting him again and again, opening and closing slowly and delicately every so often like a thirsty little mouth begging for some water. Chapter 744 Victory and Defeat, Part 2. Xietain was keeping track of the time he had left mentally. By the time about 40 minutes of the initial 60 minutes had passed, he finally put Lilith's legs down and adjusted his body so that he was almost completely lying down on the bed. With her wrists still bound and her hands above her head, Lilith looked down obediently and watched wide-eyed as Xietain planted delicate kisses on both legs, slowly moving higher and higher in tune with the sound of the sheets beneath their bodies accompanying their movements. She didn't even notice that when he approached her crotch area, slowly kissing her thighs, she spread her legs even wider as if inviting him in. Xietain naturally noticed the hope and weak pleading in Lilith's eyes as she looked at him, but even though he was tempted to fulfill her wish, he bit his tongue and endured. He had already come so far and had about 1/3 of the original time left. He knew that for his plan to succeed he needed to be slightly mean. As Xietain ascended further and further up Lilith's legs, the smell of her arousal flooded his nostrils more strongly than before. However, when he began to kiss her inner thighs and that place that only he had seen since she reached a certain age, when her private zone came into his range of vision, that sweet rose-scented smell became especially enticing and for a moment Xietain was tempted to drink from the fountain itself. Lust was truly one of the 7 deadly sins, an extremely dangerous feeling and emotion. Lilith was so horny at the moment and needed so badly to release the buildup of frustration that had been building up by Xietain all this time that she didn't even realize the danger he was in. Lilith was a succubus, and while the legend that succubi were beings that needed to absorb the life essence of men through sexual acts was false, the reality was that a succubus was indeed a charming demon. This was especially so in Lilith's case. Due to the abnormally high charm of Lilith, her natural juices had an exquisite and tantalizing aroma that enticed males to taste them. Although she didn't know what would happen if someone drank them from the source itself since she had never had a man so close to her as Xietain was at this moment, Lilith knew that man definitely couldn't get enough of her if such a thing happened. What if a first-order existence tested Lilith's excitation? Even if Xietain possessed skills such as a movable heart that helped him resist certain status effects, he would definitely fall prey to Lilith's charm without a doubt. Fortunately, however, Xietain remembered the words Lilith had said to him before his 60 minutes started running into reverse. Just hands and fingers. For now. Xietain murmured and with great difficulty moved his gaze from that precious Garden of Eden to her teary eyes. Xietain began to kiss the inner thighs of Lilith, but the sound of his lips caressing her skin was completely suppressed. Ugh, ah, ah. Lilith's moans and grunts started out soft and low, but after 5 minutes, those low moans and grunts practically turned into screams similar to that of a wounded beast moaning in lamentation and in loneliness. Xietain had no choice but to use a lot of strength to hold Lilith's body in place as she was constantly writhing, and with only 15 minutes left, Xietain decided it was time to put everything he had built up over the past 35 minutes to good use. He reached his hands up and while now powerfully licking and kissing Lilith's inner thighs he began playing with her nipples and squeezing her breasts using varying levels of mild strength. The eyes of Lilith opened abruptly and a cry of joy escaped from her wide-open mouth followed by a moan of uncontrollable pleasure. Finally! She had never been touched by a man like this before, but she definitely didn't expect such a cruel form of torture to exist. Xietain practically devoured Lilith's inner thighs and while using his thumbs and forefingers to play with her rock-hard nipples he molded her luscious breasts to his will. Xietan's mind went almost completely blank as his hands practically slid on those two big fluffy soft marshmallows. The sheet under Lilith's butt was simply a puddle at this point and the scent of her excitement had flooded the room by then. Her legs were shaking non-stop and she was shaking her head furiously as tears ran down her face. Finally, by the time 5 more minutes had passed, Xietain brought one of his hands to Lilith's crotch and for the first time in 50 minutes began to play with her lower mouth. A loud cry of surprise that immediately turned into a terrified moan fled Lilith's exquisite lips. Her moans simply grew and slithered from within her lungs as if from her very soul, echoing inside the room. Xietain carefully caressed the edges of her lips at first, gradually moving closer to the center and finally used his thumb to reach the hard, but at the same time soft little pearl that was hidden at the top of her swollen lips. Lilith's butt practically jumped off the bed as he began to play with her clitoris but her biggest reaction was when he used his index finger to tentatively touch the little hole from which juices were gushing out like a broken dam. Yes. I'm almost there. Lilith closed her eyes tightly and gritted her teeth in a gleeful smile on her tear-streaked face. She had long forgotten about the piece of cloth that bound her hands and had shredded it several minutes ago. However, perhaps subconsciously, she held her hands together and above her head as if still imprisoned by invisible bonds. Xietain had no choice but to let go of her breast and use his free hand to pull her body down and hold it in place as Lilith's back arched and her body began to spasm uncontrollably. I'm coming? I'm having an orgasm? Lilith began to mumble inconsistently, not even sure of herself as her eyes slowly began to roll as she felt a finger thrusting into her precious place. As Xietain carefully moved his thumb around Lilith's little pearl, he didn't hesitate to slowly insert his index finger into that little hole that looked like a tiny mouth constantly opening and closing in search of air. He felt her soft flesh clinging tantalizingly to his finger and Xietain got the feeling as if thousands of little tongues were licking him all over making his steel-hard manhood tremble at the mere thought of getting in there. When Lilith's body began to quiver rapidly and when the soft juicy walls that clung delicately to his index finger began to tremble intermittently, Xietain knew instinctively that she was on the verge of the climax. If he pushed a little harder, he would definitely succeed. However, Xietain had another goal besides obviously giving pleasure to his partner. Therefore, the worst of Lilith's tortures happened. She, who felt she would soon reach the 9th cloud and see the real heaven, suddenly opened her eyes abruptly and her pupils contracted repeatedly as she hurriedly looked down and screamed anxiously, "Don't stop, don't stop. I'm about to get there." Lilith was no stranger to orgasms. Even though she was a virgin, this did not mean that in her entire life she had not indulged in self-care. After all, sexual release was one of the best ways to release some of the stress that built up after so many deadly battles. Even Xietain had helped himself sometimes when he felt he couldn't take it anymore. However, Lilith was 5,000% sure that the orgasm she was about to have now was by far the most powerful one she had ever given herself. She didn't know it but she was still sure that she was one step away from ascending even if her strength didn't go up at all. Unfortunately for her, Xietain didn't hear her words and stopped his thumb movements as he pulled his index finger out of her cave but still continued to kiss her inner thighs and kept her turned on. No. Lilith cried out in fright as she felt that beautiful feeling from before start to disappear. Just then, Xietain attacked her precious pearl again and the index finger returned home. Ah! Right there! Lilith immediately felt as if she was being rescued from the abyss and quickly climbed back up the ladder to heaven. She could feel the stimulation on her clitoris and how her man used his forefinger to gently but at the same time roughly stroke her insides. However, the same thing as before happened. No. The house practically rumbled as she screamed in frustration, anger, but mostly sadness as she felt the movements of Xietain come to an abrupt halt. Lilith was in such a weakened state of mind that she didn't even realize that if she really wanted to she could pleasure herself. However, she subconsciously knew that the pleasure she would receive from herself would not be able to take her to the heights she would reach if he gave it to her. For a little over 5 minutes, Xietain gave Lilith pleasure and torture, both feelings at the same time. Every time she was about to reach the summit, he would stop, but when she was getting too low, He would quickly start stimulating her right away and make her climb back up to the same place she was before, making her fall down again. The feeling of having everything but at the same time having nothing was truly terrifying. Lilith's face was a mess of tears and her moans were mixed with increasingly desperate sobs. She seemed to have forgotten her strength and everything else. She looked really pitiful but incredibly sexy at the same time. A true work of art that any man in the universe would be more than willing to sacrifice himself for. With about only 5 minutes left, Xietain stopped kissing the inside of both of Lilith's legs, and at the same time as he accelerated the movement of his hand and fingers, he moved his body upward. His firm, hard chest pressed hard and dominantly over Lilith's 2 beautiful creamy breasts, causing their shape to change to that of 2 gorgeous ovals overflowing outward. Xietain couldn't help but groan softly at the feel of her hard nipples caressing his chest, but he endured the pleasure and brought his mouth to her ear while using his free hand to hold her head still in place. "Do you want to come, my little Lilith?" His voice was incredibly sexy, husky and raspy, dripping with lust and desire. The hot breath caressing her ears and his voice made Lilith open her eyes weakly, and as she looked up at the ceiling dazedly subconsciously, she nodded in between sobs and moans. "Then just say it," he whispered, as if he were a true sex demon trying to seduce his victim with sweet words. "Say it." Lilith sobbed in a low murmur. "Did you forget? Just call me like you know and I'll let you come." Xietain continued to press while secretly biting his tongue so hard that more and more blood filled his mouth. His lust had reached a level too dangerous at this point. He wouldn't be able to take much more. "Ah, ugh, ah." In between moans and grunts, Lilith's eyes flashed several times as her blurry mind cleared just enough for her to remember the key word she needed to say for her torture to finally end. Dysprosium. Xietan's movement stopped for a split second, but he immediately began to stimulate his partner with a lot more enthusiasm than before as he said in a slightly anxious and happy voice, "What did you say? Louder, I didn't hear you." "DDY." Lilith whispered in a simply inaudible voice. "Louder." Xietain gritted his teeth in frustration and lightly squeezed Lilith's clitoris like a button. Lilith's body jumped as her eyes opened, and as if on automatic pilot mode she finally shouted out the word that Xietain wanted to hear so badly. Lilith's scream was so powerful that the walls literally vibrated for a moment, and as she screamed her moment of release finally came. The mind of the proud and powerful 6th Order Succubus, one of the 2 most beautiful women in the universe, craved and desired by countless beings, went blank, and as her eyes rolled to the back of her head as she screamed like a banshee finally released from her jail. Chapter 745, Victory and Defeat, Part 3. It was about 5 minutes after Lilith had the most wonderful orgasm of her life, the orgasm that gave her more pleasure than she ever felt. Yet, ironically, that same orgasm was the one that made her suffer the most and tortured her to the point that she could not even think with clarity about her own existence. The dark room, dimly lit by natural moonlight and starlight, was silent except for the heavy panting of a man and the now more relaxed breathing of a woman. Lying on her back on the queen-sized bed, Lilith covered her face with her right forearm at eye level while keeping her mouth closed. Next to her, Xietain was panting like a dog while looking up at the ceiling with gritted teeth. His hard-on was harder than ever at this point, so much so that the head of his manly root was beginning to turn a monstrously terrifying purple. "Say, Lilith. You don't think you should? You know." Xietain tried to call Lilith several times but she didn't reply back. If not for the fact that he knew she was definitely awake due to the occasional movement of her still trembling body, Xietain might have thought she had fainted after he made her reach climax, because from that time on she didn't utter a word again. Xietain was suffering as if he had been thrown into the last level of hell at this moment. The natural smell of a succubus arousal was terrifying, something Xietain did not know until today. Lilith's bodily fluids were not different from aphrodisiacs, and considering that she had been spreading her scent all over the enclosed room, one could only try to imagine how great Xietan's suffering was. However, if the aforementioned were all, then Xietain might not be suffering so much. The real problem began when Lilith reached the peak of pleasure. He could still remember how powerful her climax was. Lilith had literally turned into a fountain at that moment. Her feet had planted on the bed, her butt and back arched up and her head supported the top as she drenched Xietan's body. Fortunately for everyone, only his lower half suffered and not a single drop went into his body, or else he would be in serious trouble right now. The smell inside the room was the smell of sex. There was no doubt as that obscene smell could not be mistaken even by an inexperienced person. However, unlike the smell of normal sex, this one was much sweeter and more tempting, except that Xietain didn't know it since he had never been close to such situations in the past. It was only after 5 minutes of her coming that the quivering in Lilith's body began to calm down. That's how powerful her orgasm had been. However, 5 minutes had passed and she had not said a word, barely moving in her position as she had fallen weakly after finishing. This meant that Xietain had been exposed to a powerful aphrodisiac for several minutes, and worst of all, he couldn't stop the effect with his blood manipulation skill. I will get revenge for what you did to me. Lilith's voice rang out in the middle of the almost completely silent room. Xietan's eyes shone as he heard her speak and was secretly relieved that despite the content of her words she didn't sound angry at all. In fact, there was softness and relief in her voice as if she had finally vented frustrations that had been staying with her for years. Despite his condition, Xietain was like a pig who was not afraid of hot water and coldly snorted as he proudly said, "You lost, I won. Not only did I manage to bring you to climax in less than the agreed time, but I also made you call me daddy. Come on, my little Lilith, why don't you call me daddy a few more times?" Hee. Lilith let out a giggle and slowly lowered the arm covering her face, looking at Xietain for the first time in over 10 minutes. Xietain subconsciously backed up a little as his black eyes met Lilith's eyes. Lilith's ruby-colored eyes had always given Xietain a feeling of kindness and maturity. They were full of charm and pride that made him feel warm every time he looked into them. However, Lilith's eyes at this moment were like the eyes of a true sex demon from human legends. Your eyes. What's wrong with your eyes? Lilith's red eyes seemed to be glowing. No, they didn't seem to be glowing but literally were glowing in the middle of the darkness. That red glow was so strong that Xietain almost died of fright when he was taken by surprise, but the most surprising thing of all was that even then his boner didn't weaken at all. What's wrong, Daddy Xietain? Lilith smiled devilishly and slowly moved her body until she was on her knees and hands. She stared at Xietain as she slowly moved like a cat toward him and whispered in a tantalizingly sweet voice, "Are you scared? Come, let your baby take care of you. What do you want to do?" Xietain immediately raised his guard and sat up before backing up again until his back touched the back of the bed. He looked at the seductive demon cat that was tempting him with her every advance, moving her body as if she had no bones, and warned in a serious voice, "Lilith, you're using a skill to raise my lust, aren't you? That's cheating." Although Xietain was incredibly excited, at this moment he couldn't help but fear for his personal property as he was being watched under those glowing red eyes. Fufufu. Skill? Lilith stopped when her hands were only a couple of centimeters away from Xietain. She looked into his eyes and smiled charmingly as she said in a whisper, "Daddy Xietain, your baby hasn't activated any skills, I promise. I've been a good girl for you." What the fuck was going on here? Xietain began to sweat as he noticed Lilith's glowing red eyes now focused on his rock-hard crotch. It is just one of my passive skills that hadn't been activated until now as the opportunity hadn't presented itself finally got activated. The voice of Lilith was very sweet and she really sounded like a good girl trying to please her husband. However, in the midst of that sweetness and obedience, Xietain noticed lust as high as a skyscraper about to completely overflow. This skill of mine has a very simple name. It's called lust. Lust. Xietain almost bit his tongue as he held his breath. His eyes were fixed on Lilith's flawless little white hand, now reaching out towards his groin. Uff. A sigh of relief that sounded more like a grunt than a sigh fled from his mouth as his head automatically jerked back and his eyes closed when his boner was enveloped by Lilith's soft, warm hand. Even though she had only touched his manhood with her hand, Xietain could not believe that the difference between his hand and a woman's hand could be so different. However, remembering the identity of the woman who slowly began to move her silky smooth hand up and down, Xietain understood that this feeling was special. Lust, as I said before, has never been activated until now. This is because this skill is only activated when I have a partner in my bed, conducting some kind of sexual activity and after I reach the climax. Lilith whispered in a dreamy voice as with misty eyes she followed the simple but seductive movement of her right hand. She tilted her upper body so that her breasts were squashed into the bed and her face was only an inch from her man's hardness. Still, I must say this one is quite a bit bigger than I've seen so far. Though that's also obvious considering the others weren't standing up. Xietain had been enjoying the sweet movement of his girl's hands when suddenly his previously closed eyes opened abruptly. He looked down and for a moment forgot everything as he frowned and said softly, "Have you seen others?" Lilith rolled her eyes before lifting her head and saying with a chuckle, "Of course, I did. I've seen many of these, I'd guess a few million." When the words "many of these" left Lilith's mouth she tightened her grip on Xietan's manhood a little tighter, causing him to growl under his breath as he glared at her with lion eyes. "Why are you going mad? All the ones I've seen in the past belonged to my enemies. Their armor shattered into pieces when I fought many of them so naturally, I saw them." Xietain almost spat out 7 liters of old blood and died right there when he finally realized that Lilith was taunting him. Anyway, as I was telling you, Lilith reached out her free hand and began to play with Zemon's balls. Before continuing with her explanation, she brought her face close to the tip while keeping her glowing red eyes on Zemon's. Just as his eyes widened and he mentally prepared himself for what was coming, Lilith stopped just an inch away and took a deep breath. This smell is just so good. Lilith whispered as she looked at the object only an inch from her nose with bent eyes. My skill, lust, is activated after my sexual partner manages to give me an orgasm. This skill has two passive activations. The first is always present and makes all my bodily fluids tasty and adds aphrodisiac properties to them. As for the second activation, Lilith paused, and as she looked into Zemon's eyes steadily, she put out her tongue very slowly. Lilith. Zemon began to pant heavier and his face turned red as his eyes focused completely on the pink tongue that even now continued to emerge from Lilith's mouth. His eyes widened like plates when he saw how long the tongue of Lilith was, and his heart almost stopped completely when she started to move that long snake tongue around his hardness. She didn't touch it, she just moved the tongue tantalizingly in circular motions around. My God. If she used that long tongue to wrap his root, Zemon was sure it would be the most heavenly feeling. The second activation makes every part of my body and my partner's body become a sex delight. Lilith's voice sounded in Zemon's head, only that he could no longer pay attention to such things. The lust that was already driving him crazy now had finally managed to completely overwhelm him as he watched the slow and sensual movements of Lilith's long tongue while drops of hot drool fell around his member. As if he had lost his mind, Zemon reached out both hands and grabbed Lilith's head before pushing down. Or so he tried. Fufu, just hands and fingers, remember it, little scoundrel? Lilith's tongue movement stopped and accompanied by the slurping sound quickly returned to her mouth as it swayed like a living creature and spewed drool everywhere, further increasing the wetness on the messed-up bed and raising the temperature in the room. Lilith easily grabbed Zemon's wrists and put both of them on the sides of his body. The difference in strength between the two of them was too great for him to fight. Lilith, you! Zemon glared at her with anger in his eyes, to which she replied with a devilish smile. What's wrong, Daddy? Didn't you torture me before? Do you understand your baby's suffering now? Zemon gritted his teeth and really felt like spanking her, but red right now. But, don't worry. The red light in Lilith's eyes grew, and with tantalizingly narrowed eyes, she whispered softly, I'll be a good girl and reward you for making me feel so good. Under the wide-open eyes of Zemon, she raised her body slightly and moved forward. Those two gigantic breasts, perfectly white and gleaming under the moon's glare, approached to his crotch, and before Zemon could even do or say anything, he felt his world enveloped by a sensation so soft that it threatened to send him to heaven in a single step. She let out a giggle as she watched Zemon's mouth opening and closing. Lilith pursed her lips, and as she used her hands to apply pressure on her treasures, she said in a playful voice, I think we can use these babies of mine too. Lilith moved her hands up and down in sync with her upper body. Her boobs really were like two giant cotton balls wrapping gently but firmly around Zemon's root, and his mind went blank as he stared wide-eyed at those two beautiful works of art that practically glistened due to their softness, gaining speed with each passing second and altering between slow and fast every few intervals. The amount of pre-cum coming from the tip of his weapon was such that inside the silent room the sound of Lilith's breasts squeezing tightly around Zemon's powerful hard-on sounded like a professional masseuse using creamy hands to rub a client's body. After 5 minutes, Lilith changed the way she moved her beautiful bosoms. Instead of simply moving them up and down, she moved them in opposite directions so that when her left breast went up, her right breast went down. This change of rhythm and movement caused every muscle in the body of Zemon to tighten powerfully, and subconsciously he closed his eyes to enjoy the delicious 5 minutes during which the room was filled with his grunts and the gasps of the woman between his legs servicing him, as well as the sound of her breasts now drenched with his pre-cum. XSS. How am I doing? Lilith asked, panting as her bright red eyes focused on the eyes of her partner, trying to figure out the spots that gave him the most pleasure. Zemon looked at her with gritted teeth, and the sparkle in his eyes revealed that it wouldn't be long before he shot his load. He had been holding back for over an hour after all. Despite the lust and desire in the eyes of Lilith, despite the fact that he was on the 9th cloud, Zemon was not completely swept away by the pleasure. He could notice some insecurity in her voice, which after some thought he found very reasonable, considering this was definitely the first time she was doing something like this. He reached out his right hand and stroked her hair gently as he assured her in a deep husky voice, the pleasure you're giving me is one I never knew existed. The eyes of Lilith sparkled with joy, but instead of showing it on the surface, she acted arrogant and powerful as she confidently said, Little brother Zemon, if you can hold on for another 5 minutes, this big sister will call you daddy for life. Xietain was about to open his mouth to say something when suddenly his mind went blank. Under his disbelieving eyes, Lilith quickly increased the speed at which she was moving her tits while working on his weapon with alternating movements. She was moving her breasts with such speed that in a matter of seconds they became two beautiful white blurry flashes. This sneaky woman. These were Xietan's last thoughts before the terrifying but delicious pleasure managed to overwhelm even his soul. Forget about holding on for another 5 minutes, Xietan's white load flew out like an endless torrent after only 3. The power behind his shot was such that Lilith cried out in surprise when she was hit on the chin, but her surprise soon turned to delight. She giggled like a little devil and instead of stopping she continued to move her boobs up and down in a blur. We can't let it waste, he he he. The little minx even giggled as she watched with narrowed eyes as the white liquid bathed her body. She even opened her mouth and thrust out her tongue to catch several strings of cum. Xietain had the biggest orgasm of his entire life too, probably no man on earth had ever come as much as he had that night. Chapter 746 Results and Consequences of a Different Type of Battle. Considering that Xietain had failed to endure the 60 minutes they had both agreed upon earlier and Lilith had managed to make him climax before the time limit, it was not wrong to say that he had suffered a defeat. However, since he had also managed to bring Lilith to the peak of pleasure within the stipulated time, it was not wrong to say that he had won. Victory and defeat, this applied to both Xietain and Lilith. Lying on the double-sized bed, a man and a woman were panting heavily while keeping their eyes closed. From the window with semi-transparent curtains that had been set up mainly to prevent the view from the outside but barely obstructing from the inside, the rays of rising sunlight began to illuminate the inside of the room. The color of the sky had turned from deep black to a beautiful multicolor where orange, red, yellow, and an initial trace of blue slowly spread out and took the place of the other 3. The interior of the room was a mess, to say the least. The smell that permeated the atmosphere within the 4 walls could simply be described as obscene, so much so that even a person inexperienced in carnal matters could easily and correctly identify what happened there. However, even the most experienced person in the world would definitely not be able to correctly identify that all that strong nose-burning smell was not the product of an orgy but was the result of the fierce match between just one man and one woman. It's dawning. Xietain slowly opened his eyes and looked to his left. A flash of disbelief and at the same time helplessness shone in his eyes as he muttered in an exhausted voice. It's dawn. Lying to his right, Lilith copied Xietan's movements and as she noticed the increasingly bright rays of sunlight she couldn't help but sigh. She turned her head again so that her face was pointing directly towards the ceiling and as she closed her eyes softly, she said in a sweet and pampered voice, Xietain, you are a monster. I don't want to hear that from you. Xietain sighed and adjusted himself so that his position was the same as Lilith's. After Lilith brought Xietain to orgasm once, she didn't stop there simply because she had already achieved the main goal of the little sex game the two of them had set up for the purpose of driving away the embarrassment they might come to feel as first-timers and encouraging each other to take the relationship they shared a step deeper. With over 40 minutes remaining, Lilith made sure to make the most of every second. She managed to make Xietain come 3 more times using different parts of her body before reaching the time limit and delighted in the sexy grunts he made for her, making her feel more confident and proud in the fact that she was doing a good job despite being physically inexperienced. After those 60 minutes, Lilith's horniness had reached an extremely high level again so she didn't fight back when Xietain pushed her down and began to play with her body for the second time in the night. The two had gone to bed shortly after 12 o'clock at night, and considering that the clock currently read 6:10 in the morning, the two had been engaged in sexual activities for about 6 hours in total, each giving pleasure to the other for 3 hours. During those 3 hours, Lilith had been brought to the peak of pleasure a total of 10 times by Xietain while she had managed to give him maximum satisfaction more than 20. In fact, the two had stopped because the slowly rising sunlight had awakened them from the state of lust and bestial desire for each other that they had fallen into, or else they would probably be doing it even now. If Xietain or Lilith were normal humans then there was no way such a thing was possible. However, since they were both soul evolvers things were different. Lilith turned her head to look at him and a glint of satisfaction flashed in her now normal ruby eyes. She said with a smile full of pride, Xietain, you're only level 50 but you managed to put me to battle in bed even though I cheated a bit by using agility in my movements to please you. Even under the effect of powerful aphrodisiacs you didn't lose yourself in lust and withstood my attacks for 3 whole hours. You have no idea how monstrous a feat you accomplished tonight. Lilith was proud not because of her, but she was proud of the partner she had chosen to spend her whole life with. Xietain was already capable of satisfying her body like this despite the huge difference in levels between them. Lilith was sure that in the future he would be a real monster in bed capable of completely satiating all her succubus needs. In fact, she was secretly frowning in her heart, wondering if she would really be able to keep up with him. Lilith knew that the natural stats of the little man lying next to her would skyrocket rapidly once he managed to break the stages between each order, and if his current stamina was already this brutal she couldn't help but shudder at the probably not so distant future. However, Xietain shook his head softly at her words and remarked wearily, although in fact, my body was affected by your skill lust, doesn't the same apply to you? Besides, you used agility while I had to replenish my stamina several times using regeneration. I even controlled my blood flow on several occasions to delay the inevitable. Although Xietain was aware of the difference in level and stats between the two, he couldn't help but feel a bit of bitterness in his heart. No matter how he looked at it, this encounter had been his defeat. Lilith didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she looked at the bitter smile on her beloved's face. He really had no idea how impressive his feat was, even if it was on a different battlefield than the normal one they were both used to. She sat up slightly on her left side and without warning pecked his lips before pulling back to see his expression. To her surprise, however, Xietan's expression was rather indifferent. What's wrong? Why are you looking at me with those eyes as if you were looking at an alien? Xietain raised an eyebrow in surprise. You? Don't you feel disgusted? Disgusted? Xietan's eyes widened slightly and he looked at her dumbfounded as he said with some concern in his voice, Lilith, what are you talking about? Could it be that something bad happened without him noticing? However, Lilith's next words made Xietain almost fall to the floor when he heard them. Well, I know men don't like to give kisses on the lips to their partners after your. You know what? I swallowed your thing. I don't know if you know what I mean. Lilith's voice alone would be enough to make Xietain laugh. She sounded shy and careful as she said such words even though they had fallen into a sexual frenzy throughout the night. A stark contrast to the bold, brave, and proactive Lilith that Xietain faced in bed. However, what made Xietain finally burst into laughter was the reason why she was worried. Ha 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 ha. Lilith watched as he rolled on the bed and covered his face quickly in an attempt to suppress his laughter, but seeing his shoulders shaking she knew he was laughing as hard as ever. She pouted adorably and despite her age felt like a little teenager experiencing her first love. What's so funny? She tapped the back of his head gently and said in a questioning voice. Xietain laughed for a few more seconds before slowly beginning to calm down. He turned his body again and as he sat down Lilith noticed a big smile on his face, as well as affectionate eyes as he looked at her. She blinked in surprise and confusion when he kissed her gently on the lips, pausing there for 2 or 3 seconds before slowly pulling back. Lilith, if you are willing to take something that belongs to me then how could I refuse a kiss from you? Xietain shook his head not knowing whether to laugh or cry and said in a joking tone, besides, my essence is quite sweet, isn't it? That's probably because of my skill. Lilith muttered looking at him in surprise. She had met many couples in her life, but only a pitifully small number of men did not refuse kisses from their partners after the woman performed certain actions with her mouth. Lilith always felt a certain disdain in her heart for selfish men who after receiving pleasure from their partners simply asked them to go wash their mouth, but as the years went by she simply took it for normal. Now that she knew that her partner was not a selfish man, Lilith was naturally delighted and her heart felt as sweet as honey so she couldn't help but jump on Xietain. She bathed his face in kisses but when she felt the hard object starting to awaken and poking her abdomen she stopped and quickly got off his body. Pervert. Can you blame me? Xietain cleared his throat and said in a righteous voice, you lunge at me with your naked body and your soft skin touching mine. The room is filled with essence with aphrodisiac properties. To top it off, our bodies are bathed with sexual fluids full of properties that drive the desire to mate. As you can see, I am innocent. Hearing his words, Lilith couldn't help but look around carefully for the first time in hours and a flash of disbelief shone in her pupils. For the love of God. Xietain will be angry if he finds out what you just said. Lilith ignored Xietan's little joke and quickly pushed him off the bed. You. Go take a shower, now. What? Let's take a bath together. Let's save pure water and avoid wasting such a precious natural treasure as water. Xietain proposed as she pushed him towards the private bathroom in the room. Bathe together? You think I don't know what you have in mind? Not to mention that I can wash myself using mana. Lilith retorted as she used her index finger to point downward. Xietain looked at the little Xietain who was slowly starting to raise its head and finally gave up when he realized that there was no escape for his perverted mind. Both his body and Lilith's were dirty with her or his juices mixed so they really needed to shower. Finally, under Lilith's insistence, Xietain locked himself in the bathroom and started showering. On the other hand, she opened the window wide and with a wave of her hand that obscene smell that flooded the room began to be quickly swept away and replaced by fresh air. Lilith looked at the bed, and noticing the wet mess the two had made to the point of turning it into a pool, her face blushed. She waved her hand and her space storage ring glowed for an instant, making a luxurious and comfortable-looking bed appear floating in the air. After replacing the bed, Lilith nodded and said quietly, although this little rascal's family will notice the change of. Her next words caught in her throat and her eyes widened in shock as she finally realized something that in the midst of lust, had been forgotten. My God. This wasn't a light novel where cultivators waved their hands and raised anti-sound barriers. Lilith didn't have any of those skills. Considering how noisy they had been all night, there was no way the others wouldn't know what had happened behind the door of this room. Lilith really wanted to dig down to the Earth's core and bury herself there for several millennia instead of going out to breakfast with everyone in a couple of minutes. Chapter 747, Elle didn't know you had that kind of preferences, I can call you daddy if you like, Part 1. Xieitain's house, although large and considerably luxurious, did not have a bathroom pool, but it did have a bathtub about 1.60 meters long and wide enough for two people to get in together without it feeling crowded. Because the time was tight, he couldn't wait for the water to warm up and had no choice but to cheat a little. Little fire, we have an important mission to complete. His voice sounded serious, he sounded like someone about to face a powerful enemy. The little blue flame did not immediately respond to its master's call as it usually did, and just as Xietain began to panic, he felt something stirring in a corner of his soul and quickly identified the little flame that a second later appeared before him, floating in front of his face and flickering rapidly. Although Xietain knew that such a thing was not possible, for some strange reason he could not help but feel that his trusty flame was mocking him and glaring at him even though it had no eyes. After clearing his throat and shaking off such thoughts, Xietain pointed to the tub and asked the flame to heat the water. He made sure the water did not evaporate, and in a matter of seconds the temperature reached a good point, so he quickly put his friend Little Fire away again. Xietain took a quick shower instead of staying to enjoy the warm water, and after about 10 minutes he came out of the bath. He had to change the water 3 times because the water had repeatedly become completely soiled with the sexual fluids that had practically stuck to his skin. When he came out of the bathroom in a simple robe, Xietain saw Lilith sitting on the bed. The first thing he noticed was that she was completely clean and had returned to her lily form. However, what caught his attention the most and made him frown was that she had her face buried in her hands while muttering unrecognizable words in a voice that was too low for even him to hear despite his good sense of hearing. He walked over and sat down beside her, but just as he was about to ask what was wrong with her, the door to the room was knocked softly from outside. Big brother by, big sister Lily. Auntie said you two should go downstairs, breakfast will be served in a few minutes. The expression on Xietan's face froze as the voice of little Luoning reached inside the room from the other side of the wooden door, firmly closed from the inner part. My God. The same exact words that Lilith had uttered about 10 minutes ago came out of Xietan's mouth in a mumble as he finally realized what was going on and the mistake they had made all night. Because she had not gotten a reply for several seconds, and probably because she could not hear any sound, little Luoning on the other side of the door knocked a little louder on the wood and said in a curious voice, Big brother by, big sister Lily? Are you two sleeping? How strange. Big brother by always wakes up very early and often he is not at home at this hour. Xietain did not answer little Luoning's call. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed next to Lilith and like her buried his face in his hands with his elbows resting on his knees. I'll go tell Auntie that she'd better come herself. Xietain stood up abruptly when he heard Luoning's murmur and quickly shouted, perhaps a little too loudly, wait. Big brother Bai, if you were awake why didn't you talk back to me until now? Xietain could imagine an adorable pout in Luoning's expression, but he didn't have the heart to worry about something like that and his mind was elsewhere. He cleared his throat and said in a more quiet voice, Little Ning, you go down first. Your big sister Lily and I will be down soon. Okay. Xietain heard the footsteps of Luoning hurrying away with little trots until she finally moved far enough away from the room that he could no longer hear her. He didn't even have time to say any words when the temperature inside the room suddenly plummeted, and before he knew it he felt a sharp object rubbing against his neck but not hurting his skin at all. Do you have any wishes you haven't fulfilled yet? Maybe last words you'd like to say or a message you'd like to give? Lilith's chilling voice sounded from behind him. Xietain raised both hands to shoulder height in surrender and slowly turned around to meet two beautiful but at the same time terrifyingly cold red eyes. Xietan's eyes flashed as he realized that this was probably the first time he had seen Lilith with that kind of glare, but for some reason it was quite similar to the attitude Shangguan Bingshui had towards him some time ago and still had towards others. However, his current situation did not allow him to dwell on useless thoughts. After a few seconds of silence and while his eyes carefully looked at the plain-looking sword in Lilith's hands, Xietain closed his eyes and said in a defeated voice similar to someone who had already accepted death as imminent fate, "My only request to you is simple. When you see my mother after you go downstairs, please tell her that her son has died as virgin and pure as she brought him into the world despite being tempted by a sex demon." "Bastard!" Lilith's cold eyes disappeared and the sword with which she was pointing at Xietain vanished without a trace. She let herself fall to her knees and began to sob like a little girl as she murmured in a whiny voice, "What shall we do now? Yesterday I met your parents but I already showed them such an ugly side of me. They'll surely think I'm a little pervert who cajoled you with her abilities in the bedroom." Xietain noticed that her eyes were quickly beginning to flood with tears that might fall at any moment and he quickly moved forward, letting himself fall to his knees and hugging her tightly as he hurriedly apologized. I'm sorry. I was just joking before." Xietain really wanted to bang his head against the wall as he hadn't expected Lilith to be so affected that she would be brought to the brink of tears. If he had known, there was no way he would joke about something like that. Lilith raised her head from his chest and looked at him with pleading eyes as she said in a low voice, "Say, Xietain, can I not go down? Are you planning to stay locked in the room forever?" "No. I might as well just disappear for a couple of months or 2 or 3 years from your parents' sight. They'll probably forget about it after a while." To be honest, Xietain was also as anxious as Lilith was. After all, this was the first time he was put in this kind of situation. However, when he heard the unreasonable request from Lilith he almost burst out laughing, but fortunately he stopped himself in time or he might really be cut in two by the blade of the woman in his embrace. "Listen to me, Lilith." He moved her, clutching her shoulders gently so that their eyes met, and said in a firm voice, "My family will only love you even more now, okay? Knowing my mother, she will welcome you with more love than ever, thinking that soon she might be holding a grandchild." Lilith looked at him with teary eyes and said unconvinced, "Are you sure about that? Won't she think I'm a sly little bitch?" Xietain was tempted to roll his eyes but wisely resisted the temptation and said in an assuring voice, "My mother knows the kind of man I am and naturally knows well that for me to be interested in a girl enough to bring her home and introduce her to the family, sex will definitely not be the main reason in any way." Lilith hesitated and after a moment asked in a low voice with some uncertainty, "So, what about your father?" "My father?" Xietain blinked before answering hurriedly, "He will definitely bother me later but he won't think anything bad about you, on the contrary he will probably see you under new eyes. My father knows that I'm not the type of man who casually sleeps with a random woman after all." "So, what will happen to the Wen twins and little Ning?" "They definitely heard something, especially little Ning. They're just innocent little girls, Lilith. There's no way that, like I was saying, there's no way they'd know anything about things between adults, don't you think? Come on, we've got to get moving. If we delay any longer we'll really start to be looked at with weird eyes." Xietain cleared his throat and casually stood up to prevent Lilith from seeing the flash of anger and unease that shone in his eyes as he remembered how cruel Wen Yan and Wen Yun's past had been. Lilith had naturally heard the bad things that the twins were probably forced to do. It was just that her current emotional state was quite unstable in terms of worry, so it would probably take her a while to realize that Xietan's words were not completely true. As she watched still on the floor as he quickly put on his clothes, her eyes flashed strangely and she said in a somewhat peculiar voice, "So, what will happen with your sister? Mengqi? What about her?" Xietain didn't stop and quickly buttoned a pair of rather fashionable jeans as he needed to look presentable for the meeting he would be attending after breakfast. "What do you think his reaction will be?" Lilith asked as she slowly stood up. I guess she'll look at us with weird eyes." Xietain wasn't too sure either. He finally finished dressing and clapped his hands once. "All right, enough worrying. Lilith, we didn't do anything wrong or commit any kind of sin, okay? Maybe, and except for the little girls, all of us sitting around the table today are clear that babies are not brought by a stork. Not to mention the fact that the two of them had not even come relatively close to completing the final step, but probably no one would believe such a thing even if Xietain and Lilith explained it with pictures and dialogue boxes." After she heard his words, Lilith took repeated deep breaths before finally calming down. At the end of the day, she was used to all kinds of scenarios and the reason she was worried had to do solely and exclusively with the fact that she really hoped to fit into this family without being looked at with raised eyebrows in the future. Lilith rolled her eyes as she noticed Xietan's eyes focused on her generous bosom being tantalizingly hugged by the white blouse she arrived in yesterday, and as she walked past him to open the door, she paused for a moment before whispering in his ear, "You little pervert. Many thought he had no sexual appetite or that he had different tastes than others, but few of those people knew that Xietain could become very lustful when the conditions met, and Lilith had confirmed it completely. Xietain took the egg in which his future adopted daughter was resting and quickly followed Lilith downstairs to face together what destiny had in store for them. Chapter 748, Elle didn't know you had that kind of preferences, I can call you daddy if you like, Part 2. As Xietain and Lilith walked downstairs to the dining room, they both looked at each other in silence, and for a moment, they both paused as if by prior agreement in an attempt to listen for sounds coming from the lower floor. In fact, it was strangely silent. Except for the sound of dishes being moved and kitchen utensils being moved on what appeared to be the marble kitchen countertop, there was no sound to be heard. Xietain shook his head when he noticed Lilith's questioning eyes before taking the initiative to go downstairs, being followed a step or two behind by her like a good and obedient wife. As they reached the corner of the staircase and entered the main corridor, the sight of the large living room attached to the dining room came into the line of sight of both of them after walking a couple of steps. Ah, big brother bye. Luoning jumped off the couch she was sharing with Wen Yan and Wen Yun before rushing towards Xietain. Her eyes shone with a pure light as she said with a small pout on her lips, "Big sister Lily, why didn't you talk to me earlier? Did little Ning do something wrong?" Lilith blinked and a flash of tenderness shone in her eyes. She leaned forward and gently stroked Luoning's lustrous black hair as she said with a gentle smile on her face, "Little Ning, what are you talking about? You have always behaved very well, all the big brothers and big sisters, as well as the aunts and uncles, love you very much because you are sensitive and obedient. Big sister Lily was a little sleepy, that's why I didn't talk back to you at that time." Just when Lilith's words had fallen, Mengqi appeared inside the living room followed by her mother. Both of them were carrying a tray on which there were various dishes. There were even several boxes of milk imported from abroad, which even when the economy of the base was decent was still considered a luxury among luxuries and only officers of the highest rank could take some home occasionally. "Oh, Lily, Xietain, you two are finally downstairs." Yilinger smiled sweetly, especially at the daughter-in-law her son recently introduced to her. "Give me a moment, let me finish this first. Breakfast is coming soon, you sit here child." "This. Mother, but I want to help." Yilinger didn't give her time to finish and waved a hand while saying in an irrefutable but at the same time sweet voice, "Just sit here and wait obediently. I can't let a newly integrated family member work during the first morning at home, don't you think?" Lilith had no choice but to do as she was told and obediently sat down, earning a satisfied nod from Xietan's mother. Although she felt a bit helpless, Lilith also managed to sigh in secret relief and gave Xietain a sidelong glance as she told herself that the little scoundrel was right after all. Far from looking at her with strange eyes, Yilinger was treating her like a treasure fallen from the sky now. Xietain also sighed in relief and took a step forward as he looked at his sister and said with a smile, "Mengqi, let me help you with that." Mengqi looked at him with an expression full of complaints and said in a mocking voice, "Don't worry, my dear big brother. You must be tired after training so hard at night. Why don't you better sit there and wait a bit? Breakfast will be here in a moment." Xietain froze for a brief moment before smiling bitterly in his heart. Even if he were an idiot, it would be impossible not to notice the annoyance in Mengqi's voice, which was completely understandable considering the two black circles under her eyes. Hey, big brother Xietain, big sister Lily." When Yan approached with an innocent expression after passing the laptop to her twin sister. She looked up and her bright little eyes met the curious gazes of the two people she was looking for. "Why did big sister Lily scream daddy out loud last night? Is it because she misses her daddy and had a nightmare? She even screamed so loud that Yun and I woke up in the middle of the night." When Yan blinked and stood there waiting for her big sister Lily's answer, however, several seconds passed and not only did her big sister Lily not answer her as she expected, but everyone inside the room became silent as they stared at her in a daze. Lilith really wanted to die right now and leave no trace that she had ever existed in the cosmos. She felt her face begin to heat up, and even though she was a very experienced existence in many matters, this kind of situation had never happened to her. Although Lilith knew that everyone in the house had probably heard her scream from before, she had a small hope in her heart that such a thing had not happened. However, it was clear that such a thing was not possible. Mengqi looked at Lilith in her lily form and said with a faint smile on her face, "Sister Lily, why don't you tell little Yan about your daddy and how great he is?" "Mengqi, you." Xietain looked at his younger sister, not knowing whether to laugh or cry at her behavior. But there was no need for him to say anything. After all, Lilith could defend herself. She took a deep breath and forced herself to smile. She stroked Wen Yan's hair, but her eyes were fixed on Mengqi as she said in a low, dreamy voice, my daddy is a very fabulous and strong man. Although he has all kinds of people seeking his affection, my daddy only has eyes for me and cares so much about my well-being that he is even willing to stay up all night to relieve my body heat. Meng Qi's expression turned ugly, but she quickly pulled herself together and with a snort turned around and went back to the kitchen. Wen Yan had no idea what was going on, so as she looked at Lilith she said aloud, "Whoa. Big sister Lily, your daddy must be a very good man. Why don't you call him over so we can all meet him? Our mother and father would also stay up all night when Yun or I had a fever and our bodies got hot." The innocence of the children was truly wonderful. Bai Zemin sighed in his heart as he gave Lilith a glare, silently telling her not to go too far in front of the little girls. Bai Dilan entered the living room where everyone was starting to gather and was about to say something when he almost fell to the floor with what he saw. "No! My 5,210 points!" Wen Yun shouted in terror as she stared at the laptop screen. She suddenly pushed the laptop to the side and with a leap jumped down from the couch before running towards Bai Zemin with teary eyes. Before Bai Zemin or the others could understand what was happening, Wen Yan's twin, Wen Yun, jumped towards him and clung to his body like a koala bear while saying with pitiful eyes, "Daddy Zemin, the snake grew too big and I couldn't stop it from colliding with the tail, so now I lost my maximum score." "Daddy Zemin? My goodness." Bai Zemin almost fainted when he felt two piercing gazes poking his back. "Zemin, Tuesday." Bai Dilan looked at his son with a frown. He had naturally heard the guttural moan of his son's partner echoing throughout the house. The word daddy practically made his wifey Linger jump out of bed as she looked towards the wall in the direction of the room where Bai Zemin and Lily were spending the night. However, a little girl of about 10 years old was using that word to call his son now? Bai Dilan naturally did not think good things. Bai Zemin was about to say that he had nothing to do with this but suddenly stopped when he saw Wen Yun's mischievous eyes. "This brat is really messing with me." Bai Zemin secretly gritted his teeth. Wen Yun was much more mature than her twin Wen Yan, even though they were both around 10 to 11 years old. Probably due to the events that happened in the north, the girl grew up mentally too fast, and because she felt safe and confident that Bai Zemin would never do anything bad to her, she did not hesitate to start teasing him. But worst of all, even though Bai Zemin knew the truth, no one would believe him even if he explained it 1,000 times. Bai Zemin cleared his throat and carefully pulled Wen Yun off of him from above. The girl had almost made him drop the egg he was carrying in his hands. He pointed at Bai Dilan and said in a serious voice, "Wen Yun, why don't you better go to Grandpa and give him a good morning hug?" Wen Yun was really smart. She quickly realized that Bai Dilan was angry with Bai Zemin, so she quickly ran to him and said with shining eyes, "Grandfather, good morning." Bai Dilan's eyes immediately sparkled and his earlier anger disappeared without a trace as his gaze focused on those sweet and pure eyes like those of a little angel. He smiled from ear to ear and nodded, "Good morning, little Yun." Despite his appearance of a 30-year-old, Bai Dilan was over 50. He naturally wanted to have a grandchild, so without hesitation he immediately began to like this good little girl. Bai Zemin sighed in relief as he saw that his father's attention was taken off his shoulders and Wen Yun managed to fix the situation that she herself had caused. "I'll go help in the kitchen, I'll be right back." Bai Zemin whispered to Lilith and shook his head when she tried to follow him. Linger was kind and loving but definitely fierce when it came to making herself obeyed. As Bai Zemin was heading to the kitchen after turning the corridor around the corner and thinking about how he needed to give Wen Yun a good lecture for her mischief later, it just so happened that on the way to the living room was Meng Qi, so the two naturally crossed paths. "Humph." Meng Qi snorted, still irritated. She tried to walk past Bai Zemin, but he stopped her. "What?" Meng Qi asked in an apathetic voice. Bai Zemin forced a smile and said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, "I say, my dear little sister, this big brother of yours did something to offend you? Other than being one of the main culprits who kept me up all night while I listened to the perverted things you did and how you grunted with pleasure while that girl named Lily you brought home moaned nonchalantly and without a care in the world? Don't worry, my dear big brother, you haven't offended me at all." Bai Zemin was at a loss for words to say for several seconds after he saw and heard his sister speak fast and loose as if she was a robot or as if she had planned it in advance. As Meng Qi looked at him with wide eyes and gasped in indignation while catching her lost air, Bai Zemin finally sighed and nodded. "I'm sorry, it's my fault. The Goblin War just ended and you two fought on the front lines for days. You must have longed for a good night's peaceful sleep, but in the end you couldn't close an eye all night. I apologize on behalf of myself and Lily. I will make sure the same thing doesn't happen a second time." "What? No, it's not that." Meng Qi wanted to go crazy, but now that her brother had apologized so honestly she had no room to unleash her fury. She didn't want to blame Bai Zemin. After all, Mengqi was aware that her big brother was the person who needed the most rest given that he hadn't slept in 5 days counting the night before. Mengqi stomped on the ground and an adorable pout appeared on her exhausted face as she said in a voice that was filled with hidden bitterness, "Big brother, you always do the same thing every time I get upset with you about something, even in the past you were the same way. It's not fair." Bai Zemin kept his expression on the surface but in his heart he was apologizing to his sister. He knew that to appease Mengqi's anger when she was about to turn into a little devil, the best way was to admit mistakes and she would end up feeling aggrieved and even apologize for her behavior later. Mengqi took several deep breaths, and after a few seconds during which they both remained silent, she surprised Bai Zemin with a faint smile. Bai Zemin had seen many kinds of smiles on his sister's face, he often compared them to flowers or cute animals when they were small. However, this was the first time he felt that his ever-reliable and mature younger sister's smile resembled the smile of a cunning little fox. For some reason, he felt he didn't want to listen to her next words or he would be too surprised by what she was about to say. However, he didn't have time to open his mouth before Mengqi opened her little lips. "My dear big brother. I didn't know you had that kind of preferences, I can call you daddy if you like." Mengqi's voice lived up to her little fox smile. Despite her youthful appearance and real age, she sounded like a woman with a lot of experience in the life of seduction and for a moment Bai Zemin was at a loss for words to say. Chapter 749 New Target, Xietain District, Part 1/2. After several seconds during which both Bai Zemin and Mengqi remained silent with him trying to comprehend and analyze the words his sister had said, and with her watching his face in an attempt to understand the effect her words have had on her brother, Bai Zemin's frozen expression finally broke. Mengqi felt her heart beat a little faster and she didn't deny the fact that she felt a little scared when she saw her brother's serious expression. However, as she felt footsteps behind her, an idea popped into her head and before Bai Zemin could do anything she turned and ran towards Xietain who was approaching carrying another tray full of food. "Princess, don't run while carrying the dishes." Xietain sighed. Mengqi turned a deaf ear and while hiding behind her pointed at Bai Zemin with a shake of her head as she said with fake fear, "Mom, Daddy Zemin is bullying me." "Daddy Zemin?" Xietan's hands trembled and she almost knocked over the tray she was holding. However, she quickly calmed down, and seeing the incredulous expression on her son's face, she couldn't help but secretly shake her head. Xietain had naturally heard when her son's partner screamed out loud the night before. It was only natural for Mengqi to hear it too considering that not only was her level higher than Xietan's, but Bai Zemin's and Mengqi's room were closer to each other compared to the master bedroom. "Okay, princess. Stop messing with your brother, look at the surprised expression on his face, he looks like he will faint soon. Let's go eat breakfast before the hot dishes get cold." Xietain smiled slightly and shook her head before continuing on her way. "Okay." Mengqi nodded and quickly followed her mother, but not before stopping to stick out her tongue and wink at her brother before making a hasty escape. Bai Zemin, who was only a second short of getting angry at Mengqi, was speechless as he looked at the backs of his mother and younger sister. That little minx. He shook his head not knowing whether to laugh or cry before finally following behind the two. During breakfast, Lilith's fears did not come true, and except for the occasional glares from Mengqi, she was treated very well by both Xietain and Bai Dilan. She had integrated into the family so well that Bai Zemin's mother had asked her to at least stay for the day so that the two of them could talk more about Bai Zemin. Lilith naturally agreed since she would be able to learn things about Bai Zemin during his past years while Xietain would be able to learn more about the months she was separated from her son that seemed like centuries of time. After breakfast, Bai Zemin together with Bai Dilan went straight to the government building where practically all the high command officials of the Chinese Renaissance faction had gathered. Of course, people like Shangguan Bingshui, Qin He, Zhongde, Nangong Lingxin, Kai Jinji, Evangeline, and Shen Mei were also present. As for Wu Yijuan, she was in charge of another important task that Bai Zemin delegated to her so she was not present at this time. In fact, after breakfast, Mengqi had gone to Wu Yijuan's house. The meeting lasted about 2 hours, and it was close to 9 a.m. when everyone started to leave the premises. Some of them had shadowy expressions on their faces while others were relaxed and walked normally, full of confidence. In the meeting room, Wu Keqian forced a smile and said feeling a bit helpless, "Say, Zemin, kid. Wouldn't it have been better for you to wait before announcing that you would make a reform in power?" Wu Keqian had arranged this meeting to inform that from today he would be stepping down from his position as top leader and that from this very moment onwards the person with full power was the young man who had been getting some weird looks because of the egg he was holding with wariness. Even though Zemin's popularity had skyrocketed over the past few days due to his incredible feats of not only obtaining technology that was far above the current Earth, the acquisition of a powerful futuristic warship, and of course, his performance in the war against the goblins, there were actually some people who seemed to have never heard of him until today. Uncle Wu, those kind of wide-bellied people that only know how to eat, sleep, and have sex with several women don't need mercy nor do they need time to adapt to changes. Zemin said as he gently caressed the egg in his embrace. If they accept the changes and adapt, they will survive. If they cannot accept the changes and do not adapt, then it means they are not fit for the new world we live in. Those people didn't even have a clue about the situation in the base, the proof is that they didn't even hear my name all these days. Zemin had no problem keeping lazy survivors who didn't want to do anything behind his walls, as so far all of them eventually looked for work after realizing that they couldn't go on like this. However, he would definitely not allow a couple of old bums with no ability whatsoever to enjoy luxuries just because. All the people you want to strip of their positions and titles were once people with some important position in the previous world. Wu Keqian pointed out, trying to get Zemin to reconcile his idea. They were once. Previous world. Past tense, not present. Sun Ling added from the side. Wu Yijuan's mother was wearing leather clothing belonging to some mutant beast that clung to her body tightly, covering her completely but still leaving little to the imagination. She looked at her husband and said with a slight smile, I think what this little guy is doing is the right thing to do. During the early stages it was okay to protect those people since they had connections that could be exploited, but now it no longer makes sense to give them privileges they don't deserve. Wu Keqian sighed, and after several seconds he finally gave up, nodding his head without adding much more. He was no longer the lord of this place, and it was only a matter of time before everyone accepted Zemin as the new leader. In fact, Wu Keqian had lost much of his power after losing his subclass, but he was fine with that as long as things could stabilize and his people could live better. Because the news needed to spread, Zemin had not yet received an upgrade in his subclass. After all, for the sole record to identify him as the leader of a human settlement it was necessary for the humans of that settlement to know of his existence, and such a thing would probably take a few more days. However, what surprised Zemin was that even when the 200,000 or so reconverted humans who stayed with him and decided to serve him joined his faction, his subclass had still not advanced at all. Counting those who were in the northern base and the approximately 200,000 reconverted humans who were temporarily staying in the Sky Destroyer, the total number of survivors under Zemin's command numbered approximately 235,000. It seemed that the gap between the Lord level and the next was a lot bigger than the previous gaps. After the meeting ended, Zemin and the others headed straight to the Wu family mansion where they spent practically the entire afternoon reading a tiny portion of the books obtained from one of the 5 silver pagodas. Those books contained precious information for them, and needed to be understood so that in the future they could exploit that knowledge to its fullest potential. Books of medicinal herbs with illustrations and explanations of their possible uses or functions, poisonous herbs and different types of poison, edible herbs that could replace certain vegetables without any problems, etc. Cookbooks detailing different methods that could not only make food more delicious but also explain the way in which the meat of mutant beasts or mutant vegetables needed to be cooked in order for them not to lose their properties and for the body to absorb as many of their benefits as possible. Farming books that explained how to make the most of the land in different types of areas. It was also detailed that from the second stage of evolution, the Earth would experience changes in its territories and that even the warmest places could have cold areas. The same applied in the opposite case, so it was now possible to plant or find things that usually would not be there. Rune books. These books were Mengqi's focus since the others could not understand them at all. She spent the entire afternoon and evening completely immersed in them, starting at the basic level and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. The amount of books was simply colossal, so much so that even with more than 20 people reading several of them had not even reached 2% of the total after a whole evening. This was because there were so many books covering a single subject and advancing in difficulty that they had to start reading from Volume 1 to understand Volume 2. By the time night began to descend, everyone was planning to stay at the Wu family home as it would be more comfortable that way. The mansion was large enough to accommodate everyone without any problems and even provide private rooms for each of them. They could rest when they were tired and continue reading books comfortably instead of having to move around, wasting precious time. However, Zemin shook his head, and once he had a rare moment alone with Shangguan Bingshui, he told her about the matter of the zombie attack in alliance with the mutant beasts on the North Base. When Shangguan Bingshui heard that the Eastern Sea race was targeting the human establishments on the mainland, a flash of anger shone in her blue eyes. Do you think that mermaid princess doesn't have something to do with all this? Don't you find it suspicious that just when we decided to form an alliance with her, one of her brothers shows up trying to dominate the human camps? It seems too much of a coincidence to me. Bai Zemin looked up at the now completely dark sky from the top of the mansion and said in a deep voice, I don't want to think that Xian Meier betrayed us in any way. Xiao Xiao will wake up in a few hours, she will deliver Xian Meier's message to me, and depending on that I will see which direction we will move from here. Shangguan Bingshui nodded, if you have already decided, then I am fine with whatever you have in mind. After a moment of silence, Bai Zemin looked sideways at her and said softly, Bingshui, have you thought about what you will do now? What do you mean? She looked at him in confusion, to which Bai Zemin replied, depending on the words Xian Meier could say, in a week's time we will move southward to conquer Xietain district. Xietain district. Shangguan Bingshui muttered before turning her head to look up at the starry sky. Xietain district was where her mother lived, someone Shangguan Bingshui wanted to see anxiously. These anxieties were the source of her greatest fear that her mother had failed to survive, or that she had to do low acts in order to have something to eat. However, Shangguan Bingshui was also worried that the loving mother she knew might have completely changed considering everything that had happened in this short period of time. At the same time, it was in Xietain district where the highest officials in all of China were located, the true core of the country. It would probably be the most difficult district to take over as there would definitely be many military establishments there. But Shangguan Bingshui knew that the reason Bai Zemin was asking her that question was another one. Bingshui's real surname was Shen Yuan, not Shangguan. Her father, the person she had hated the most throughout her life, the person she had wanted to surpass in every way and the reason she had worked so hard to the point that she had practically abandoned the life of a normal girl completely from a very young age, the main source of Shangguan Bingshui's hatred and distrust of men. Xianyuan Wentian, the president and the highest authority in all of China, also resided in Xietain district. Have you made your decision? Bai Zemin asked in a low voice, and just like her, he looked up at the distant sky as he calmly said, remember, Bingshui, whatever you decide you will have the entire faction backing you, and naturally it include myself. If you want the man named Xianyuan Wentian to live, then he will live. If you want the man named Xianyuan Wentian to die, then he will die. If you haven't decided yet then that's fine, you still have a little more time to think. Chapter 750 New Target, Xietain District, Part 2/2. No matter how much hatred Shangguan Bingshui might feel in her heart, and no matter how much she wanted to crush Xianyuan Wentian, this person was, at the end of the day, her father. Even if Shangguan Bingshui did not care at all about the fact that this man's blood ran inside her veins, she also had to consider her mother's feelings and thoughts on this important matter. She did not know whether her mother was still in love with that man or not. Shangguan Bingshui wanted to believe that this was not the case, but taking into consideration the fact that her mother had never tried to be happy again and only devoted herself to raising her, she could not rule out this possibility. Therefore, she had to think very carefully about the direction of her next course of action. Bai Zemin returned to his family home by himself this time. Bai Dilan and Meng Qi decided to stay overnight at the Wu family mansion, especially Meng Qi. She had not even stopped reading rune books or similar content and was completely absorbed in them. He explained the situation to his mother before heading to the back of his family's property, leaving Lilith and Yi Linger alone. The two women seemed to be getting along even better now. This was true to the extent that Yi Linger was practically ignoring Bai Zemin now and all her focus had been practically entirely on her new daughter-in-law. Upon reaching the edge of the pool, Bai Zemin squatted down and peered inside with nothing but starlight dimly illuminating the surroundings. Xiao Xiao seemed to still be asleep, she would probably wake up soon though. Bai Zemin didn't know the reason but he just knew. He took off his boots and put them aside before sitting on the edge of the pool and dipping his feet into the water. Phew. Cold as hell. Bai Zemin muttered under his breath, and as he raised his head to the sky, he couldn't help but notice that winter was approaching. The nights were already so cold now and sometimes 1 or 2 corpses were found, stray survivors that had frozen to death in the middle of a freezing night. When winter came it would definitely be a horrendous situation that Bai Zemin didn't even want to think about. Although it was still about 1.5 months before winter descended on China, this was an estimate according to the previous world. With all the changes the Earth had experienced and would continue to experience, nothing was 100% certain anymore. I need to get the wool machines to start producing more warm clothing. But I'm afraid I'll have to invest a lot of mutant beast furs to reinforce the normal clothing with some mana. Bai Zemin thought under his breath as he swayed his feet gently in the water. The wool or cotton of the past would definitely not be able to fight against extremely low temperatures. China had regions in which snow was common during cold seasons, but with the laws of the earth enhanced after the evolution and absorption of huge amounts of mana, Xietain was 100% sure that what was coming in the future would be something never seen before. While it could be that he was thinking too much or maybe he was being too pessimistic, Xietain believed that it was better to expect the worst so that the future would not catch him with his pants down. After all, a single mistake or a small detail ignored could be the cause of death of hundreds of thousands and the downfall of entire nations in this new world. Xietain did not realize that he had been sitting in the same position for more than 2 hours. This was a rare moment of solitude that he could take advantage of to clarify many of his thoughts, and it was also because he managed to think of several new ideas as well as countermeasures to possible future problems that he did not notice the passage of time. Pooh! A joyful sound characteristic of a single existence brought Xietain back to the real world, and as he lowered his head his eyes darker than night itself met two beautiful bright pink eyes that looked at him with happiness and enthusiasm. Xietan's eyes flashed slightly and chuckled as he leaned his body forward and dipped his hands into the icy water. Xiao Xiao quickly swam towards him, and with a small sound similar to a cat's purring let herself rise from the water. Xietain did not mind his clothes getting wet, and while holding the little pink dolphin in his left arm, he did not lose his grip on the egg in his right arm. "My dear Xiao Xiao, how are you feeling now?" "Pooh Piu." The little dolphin's eyes sparkled as she nodded her little head as if to show that she was full energy and could fight several hundred deadly battles right now. After a minute or two of chattering, Xietan's expression slowly turned serious as he asked in a low voice, "Xiao Xiao, did Princess Xietain reply to your message from before?" Xiao Xiao's eyes also took on a certain seriousness, and with a mighty nod she quickly activated one of her spiritual skills. Xietain saw Xiao Xiao's eyes brighten, and a second later he felt something hit his head. The spiritual earring in his left ear seemed to light up for a moment, but as if the treasure knew that this was not an attack, it immediately turned off and did not get activated, allowing the spiritual wave sent by Xiao Xiao to directly hit his brain. Xietan's eyes went blank for a brief moment, he lost all sense of the outside world, his head hurt as if someone had given him a fierce hammer blow to the back of his head, but all that strange feeling disappeared so fast that his brain didn't even have time to really feel that pain, as if it had been an illusion. When his eyes cleared, his expression was uncertain as he remained silent for several seconds, during which the only sounds that accompanied him were the sound of the pool water moving and the wind blowing from the different wooded areas. Xiao Xiao looked at him without making a sound, and after a full minute, Xietain gently kissed the small animal's forehead as he thanked her with a faint smile. "Thank you for your help, Xiao Xiao." "Pooh." The little pink dolphin's eyes closed and took on a crescent shape as a soft, sweet sound came out of her little mouth. She was clearly pleased with the compliment and reward she had just received. Xietain looked up at the sky and muttered under his breath, "Looks like that mermaid princess finally woke up from her soft and gentle personality. That's good for me. Now I can progress with my plans for the future." The message Xietain had sent him was very simple, but at the same time complex, as it revealed a lot of information despite its little content. "Let's meet at the northern shore of the place you call Yangfang district in a month's time. I accept your previous offer, I will aim for the throne." A faint smile that slowly began to grow into a rather terrifying one appeared on Xietan's face as he looked up at the white stars shining amidst the dark sky. It was those seemingly insignificant little dots that prevented the terrifying darkness from achieving its goal of swallowing the entire world. "You and I are like those tiny white dots in the middle of a huge black blanket, Xietain. The two of us may seem insignificant in everyone's eyes, not knowing that we can scatter the darkness together. Great heavies of the past with high positions in the government or the army would definitely not pay attention to a young nobody like Xietain. They definitely took advantage of their influence during the first 2 months to establish powerful factions, probably some of them even had 500,000 or more in their bases. However, Xietain had already managed to take down people like this, with the most recent being Wu Keqian, a mayor of an entire large district who, thanks to Wu Yijuan's intervention, wisely surrendered after realizing that he had no hope of defeating Xietain in combat. It definitely wasn't going to be a bloodless path from now on. The same was true of Xietain. She was ignored by her family and had never been seen as a danger. However, Xietain knew that she had talent, and all she lacked was decisiveness and ferocity in her blood to increase her hunger for power. The entire East Sea royal family would be shaken to its foundations when Xietain and the seventh princess that had always been ignored and despised by all would join hands. With him on land and her on the seas, the two of them would be like the small but bright stars in the sky, small but whose influence would one day be able to cover the whole world. Time really does fly, and in what seemed like a single instant, a week passed. It was time to face the former president, probably the most terrifying human enemy the Xietain faction would face for some time. Of course, many things happened during that week, among them was the birth of the future Queen of the Ants, Xietain's adopted daughter. However, an accident of sorts happened during the birth process of Xietain's daughter, something that would make everyone's life more interesting.